Hey, you guys. Welcome back to the salon. So, I have to confess that I've always had kind of a little soft spot for the very cheesy 1970s eco horror movies that I saw time and time again on cable when I was growing up. I mean, I guess there was just something about the concept of this large ensemble cast of usually past their prime actors, let's put it that way, kind of pitted against this series of largely woeful special effects that were meant to convey armies of gargantuan critters kind of like bearing down on them. There's just something about that combination that really made me feel all warm and fuzzy inside. Now, obviously, if you know anything about movies, horror sci-fi movies, films about mutated animals like growing to giant size and or becoming exceptionally aggressive and attacking humans weren't an exclusive product of the 1970s, obviously. In the 1950s, you had the big bug films like Them from 1954, which was giant ants. You had 1955's Tarantula, which, was a tarantula. And in 1957, you had Beginning of the End, which was like giant locust cricket type bugs. And because it was the age of anxieties about the atomic bomb, also, again, obviously, it's almost always radiation in the movie that causes the crisis, causes the animals to like grow really big. But then in 1962, Rachel Carson published her seminal environmental work, Silent Spring, which exposed the horrors of DDT and like other harmful pesticides that were used at the time. So the book was massively, massively influential in kicking off the environmental movement in the 1960s and was kind of the main impetus behind the eventual banning of DDT in the United States in 1972. And part of the book's larger impact, I feel like, was getting people to think more seriously about what all these chemicals were doing, like to our air and our water and the plant and animal life that kind of surrounded and sustained us. And as any good film scholar will tell you, widespread cultural anxieties like this always find a way to bleed into a particular era's horror films. In spite of that, though, it took a while for the eco horror boom to really find its feet. I feel like, Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds was released in 1963, like only a year after Silent Spring came out, but it was based on a Daphne du Maurier story from 1952, and it honestly didn't really explain, like, what made the birds, like, go crazy and like start attacking people. So it wasn't like radiation or anything like that, or at least it wasn't explicitly laid out in the narrative. So it wasn't really until 1972's Frogs that the sort of like classic, what you think of as like the 1970s eco horror narrative, like came into full flower. In short, it would be like a group of generally pretty unsympathetic, like rich folks and or corporate types who are somehow raping the land in some way or another, get their deserved comeuppance when a bunch of pissed off animals decide to open up a waste barrel full of whoop ass on these entitled humans and, knock them a few pegs down the food chain. Now, despite the title, Frogs actually featured a bunch of different creatures, not just frogs. There was like snakes, spiders, leeches, I think at one point, lizards, alligators, birds, and I think even butterflies at one point, which, yeah, that was really something. So all those animals like turned the tables on the people. Although in Frogs, like none of them got really big or mutated in any way, not that I remember anyway. They were just really, really mad. So that same year, in 1972, also saw the release of the absurd but massively entertaining Night of the Lepus, which, if you haven't seen it, is about giant, adorably bloodthirsty bunny rabbits like attacking people. And then came Phase 4 from 1974, which was ants again, but they were regular size this time, although they were really, really intelligent. You had Grizzly in 1976, which was kind of more like a Jaws ripoff than, because Jaws is kind of, I don't know if I really consider that eco horror necessarily. That's more just like a monster movie. Then you had Day of the Animals and Kingdom of the Spiders from 1977. I was actually going to include Kingdom of the Spiders in this review too, but I didn't have time to watch it, so I might do another one of that like later on. Then you had, in 1978, you had Piranha, which obviously killer fishies. You had the Australian film Long Weekend, which was a bunch of different animals. And you had The Swarm, which obviously was bees. And then in 1979, you had Prophecy, which was mostly focused on like a mutated bear creature. I think it was mercury causing it in that case, but also had some like big ass fish and big ass tadpoles and some really, really aggro raccoons, again, if I remember correctly. I kind of feel like after 1980s Alligator, like, you know, the subgenre of eco horror kind of carried on into the 1980s, but after Alligator came out in 1980, which is about a gigantic alligator like in the sewers, you know what I mean? I kind of feel like the films after that started to focus more on mutated people, like rather than animals. Like you had movies like Chud or The Toxic Avenger or The Stuff or maybe Street Trash to like a lesser extent, but it started focusing less on animals getting revenge and more like, you know, the chemicals kind of seeping up into like humans and like mutating them instead. But two of the eco horror movies that I remembered most from my childhood, for whatever reason, are the double feature, the pair that I'm going to be talking about today. Neither one of them are honestly all that great. They're actually both pretty terrible, like from an artistic standpoint. But there's just something about their just very chintzy awfulness that I always found really appealing, which, you know, that's probably a feeling I should explore with a good therapist someday. But there you go. So the first of these, 1976's The Food of the Gods, is very loosely based on the first third, I believe, of the H.G. Wells novel from 1904, which is called The Food of the Gods and How It Came to Earth. It was actually written and directed by veteran schlockmeister Bert I. Gordon, who definitely knows his way around a giant creature movie, having been responsible for such cinematic masterpieces as King Dinosaur from 1955, The Amazing Colossal Man from 1957, Earth versus the Spider from 1958, Village of the Giants, which actually came out in 1965 and coincidentally was also based on the same H.G. Wells novel, Food of the Gods, and also the second movie in today's double feature, Empire of the Ants from 1977, which we'll be talking about in a bit. Other than Empire of the Ants, every single movie that I just named was featured on Mystery Science Theater 3000, so that should really tell you something right there. So at the beginning of Food of the Gods, we meet our main protagonist, Morgan, who's actually played by Marjoe Gortner. Now, this guy, if you don't know who that is, he actually first rose to prominence back in the day, like as a child evangelist, and in 1972, like somebody made a documentary like about his life, like a behind the scenes, like a day in the life of a televangelist or an evangelist type thing. And that documentary, which was just called Marjoe, won an Oscar. So he got like pretty famous from that. So he decided to like parlay that success into an acting career. So he wasn't anything like all that great, but he was in like Earthquake in 1974, which that was another thing in the 70s was like disaster movies. Maybe I should do like an offshoot on that too. Oh, and he was also, I actually knew him most from the lovably terrible 1978 Italian Star Wars knockoff Star Crash. He was in that as well. So Morgan, his character, is a professional football player. And one weekend, him and a couple of his buddies go off to the wilderness for a relaxing hunting trip or whatever. While they're there, though, one of the dudes is stung to death by wasps. I mean, basically like the size of mallard ducks, or at least that's kind of what the plot synopsis would have you believe, that this guy was stung to death by giant wasps. In actuality, like if you watch the movie, the poor man appears as though he's just kind of thrashing around violently in the woods while painted on smudges that sort of resemble large insects kind of float harmlessly around on the film stock. Yeah, I'll probably bring this up again, but the special effects on this movie, even for 1976, are pretty dire, and they aren't even really as good as some of Bert I. Gordon's work from the 1950s, which is really saying something. Maybe it's just because you expect less from the 50s and it's black and white, so they could get away with more, but yeah, the special effects in Food of the Gods look pretty terrible. So after his friend gets stung to death and he looks like all fucked up and everything, Morgan goes out to look for help, and he comes across this isolated cabin which houses this very suspicious older woman named Mrs. Skinner, who's actually played by the legendary Hollywood actor, writer, director Ida Lupino, who is obviously like slumming here big time. Also, he finds a barn with some enormous fucking chickens in there, one of which just totally goes ham on Morgan in like a hilariously awesome scene. It's like so funny. So Morgan like kills this, colossal cock with a pitchfork, and then like all the other hens who are also humongous like just look on impassively like, huh, I guess those things will happen. And then so after that whole situation, Mrs. Skinner starts laying some exposition down on him. So Mr. and Mrs. Skinner are just some simple farm folk, don't you know? And they've been praying to God for something or other. I'm not really clear what. And then, wouldn't you know it, their prayers were answered, I guess, because some weird ooze that sort of looks like eggnog, like starts flowing out of this rock on their farm. Now, they're really, really excited at first because they think that it's oil, even though, okay. I mean, but even after twigging onto the very obvious fact that it's not oil, I mean, have they never seen like the Beverly Hillbillies? I mean, it's called black gold for a reason. But anyway, so once they figure out that it's not oil, it's not the brightest, are they? They decide, because, they're going to mix it with the chicken feed and give it to their animals. Because, why not just stuff some random runoff like down the gullets of your valuable livestock? Seems like the most obvious thing to do, right? So the Skinners, Mr. Skinner's already dead, by the way, though his wife doesn't yet know this. They have jars full of this kind of runny oatmeal looking shit, like in their house. And predictably, like some other hungry little critters have gotten into it, including some mealworms or maggots or something. I'm not really sure what they were supposed to be, which kind of like grow to the size of French loaves and chew on Mrs. Skinner's hand. And then, going on up the food chain, like some rats get into it too. And of course, they morph into these big, like super rodents about the size of a Volkswagen. So, in fact, speaking of Volkswagens, Mr. Skinner's own Volkswagen Beetle got a flat tire like the day before or something like that. And the car subsequently got stormed by these big ass rats. And they, chewed up Mr. Skinner real good, hence why he never came home. So after all of this alarming information is conveyed, Morgan and his other hunting buddy, who I think his name is Brian, if I'm remembering correctly, they leave the third dead, bloated, wasp-stung guy, like, back with the coroner, like, on the island. And then they take the ferry back to the mainland to kind of get back to their sports ballery. But for whatever reason, Morgan, who, remember, is a professional football player. He's not like a scientist or a cop or an investigative journalist or anything like that. He decides he's going to travel back to the island for reasons and find out what's going on in regards to all this abominations against nature that seems to be going on this island. He also somehow persuades his friend, maybe Brian, to accompany him, even though this whole thing really has fuck all to do with them. I mean, other than their friend getting killed, I guess. So once they get back to the island, they run into some more giant rat fodder in the form of a pregnant woman and her boyfriend whose RV got stuck in the mud while they were on vacation, so they're like stranded here now. There's also this greedy, hateful corporate asshole who's looking to cash in on this whole food of the gods thing because he heard about it somehow, I guess. I'm not really sure how. And he also has like a assistant who's a microbiologist who also can't stand him. She's played by Pamela Franklin, who was in The Innocents as a kid and was also played the psychic in The Legend of Hell House. So she's also working considerably beneath her talents in this turd. So after the corporate douchebag is attacked by the deadly film stock smudges, I mean the giant wasps. They're giant wasps. Supposed to be. I mean, they look really bad, you guys. It's unbelievable. So after that happens, Morgan and Brian go and successfully blow up the wasp nest. But then, shortly after that, the rats kind of start getting restless, and although the gang are able to drown some of them, and then they rig up this electric fence kind of thing that takes a few more of them out, eventually they're kind of forced to hole up in Mrs. Skinner's cabin while the rodents, like, essentially overrun the area. Now, in between all of the giant critter action, there's all kinds of other ridiculousness, which is, like, really, really... You just have to see it to believe it, to be honest with you. One of the funniest things to me was that Morgan, like I said, professional football player, he just basically steps into this whole situation and fucking takes charge, like bossing everybody around, seemingly knowing how to do pretty much everything, knowing everything about like legal stuff and like fucking firearms and like making stuff and all this, like, even though there's absolutely nothing establishing like why he would know all this shit. So he just comes in and he's like the king of the world. There's also a very funny scene where Pamela Franklin's character straight up propositions him for sex, like right in the middle of like an impending rat siege. You know, to his credit, he's just like, yeah, we'll talk about this afterward. But I was just kind of like, what the actual fuck is going on with that? Also, there's a scene where the corporate dickhole is like spending ages and ages like out in the yard, like scooping the food of the gods like out of the ground and into any receptacle he can lay his hands on. He's like bring me more buckets and bring me more bottles and this all the other thing. And all the while he's kind of like waxing rhapsodic about how he's gonna grow these, because he cares so much about feeding the hungry, which obviously he doesn't, and he doesn't even make any like fucking, he's like, yeah, I really fucking care about that. Well, you know what I mean? It's kind of like that kind of thing. But yeah, he's like, he's gonna grow giant chickens and cows, and I already thought I'm gonna grow jumbo-sized plants like to feed them with, without ever like obviously taking into consideration like where exactly on the planet he's gonna fit all this shit, and you know what exactly would happen if something went even more awry than it already has, and he ends up with like Cowzilla or something. So at the end of the movie, like after they've drowned all the rats and burned their corpses, and also they've torched all the remaining food of the gods, or so they think, it's revealed that some of the substance actually escaped destruction and made its way into the surrounding streams, where it eventually ended up in the food and water of some local dairy cows. So the very last scene like shows this kind of wide-eyed school kid drinking some of the tainted milk, and you know, leaving the audience to wonder how long it'll be before this child is lumbering down the streets of Anytown, USA, like some baby-faced Paul Bunyan or something. So in case you couldn't tell, the script of this thing is just wretchedly bad, but I think that that's what makes this movie so fucking entertaining to me. Characters just somehow know things, like without any explanation or preamble. They say and do like intensely stupid things just because the plot demands it, and all of the actors are taking everything like way too seriously, which makes it that much more hilarious. Now, I will say that one thing that is absolutely not all that funny about this movie is the way that the rats appear to have been treated. Now, I'm not sure if any of them were irreparably harmed by this, because I don't know if this was before or after the whole, you know, monitoring the animal action type shit. But there are some sequences in this movie where they're supposedly being shot, like, you know, the characters are shooting them with shotguns. And while I don't think that Bert I. Gordon would have really shot at rats just for a movie, at least I hope not, it does look like, if they weren't really being shot, it does look like somebody was at least like pitching something red and squishy at them, like hard enough to sometimes like send them flying. I'm also not sure if some of the rats were actually drowned, like during a few of the sequences. But again, if they weren't, there are times when they look like they're just kind of like struggling underwater. I know rats can swim, but there are some like shots of them underwater where it looks like they're not having that good of a time. And honestly, that's just like really, really shitty overall, especially like for a movie as kind of crummy as this one is. So, I mean, if you love like really cheap jack 1970s schlock with terrible special effects and mostly decent actors doing things they're not proud of, then you'll probably be pretty amused by Food of the Gods. Though I will admit that I had forgotten about all the violence, whether it's simulated or real, against the rats, and all of that just really ended up leaving a bad taste in my mouth. I can't deny that all the rest of the stuff with the humans was funny as shit, though. So next up on this Killer Nature double feature is another Bert I. Gordon joint, 1977's Empire of the Ants. Now, this one isn't as kind of patently absurd and slapdash, I guess, as Food of the Gods is, which makes it, I gotta admit, like considerably less entertaining in as far as like a so bad it's good sort of way. And there are stretches of it in the middle section that seem like they take a fucking eternity, like even though the entire movie is only 90 minutes long. Now, when I first started watching it, I haven't seen this movie in like a really long time. I admit that I was initially very confused, like when all the victims started being attacked by giant ants, because I was certain that I remembered the ants being normal ant size. But then I thought, well, maybe I'm remembering the aforementioned and, you know, honestly far superior 1974 movie Phase 4, which, as it happens, was also a loose adaptation of the same H.G. Wells story, Empire of the Ants, that this was based on, which came out in 1905. The ants in that original story, by the way, were regular sized, but highly intelligent and organized, not big fuckers like you see in the 1977 movie. I mean, on the whole, Phase 4 is not only a better movie, but it's also a more faithful adaptation of Wells's story. So, at the beginning of Empire of the Ants, we have a bit of documentary footage that's talking about how fucking creepy it is that ants are so smart and so organized. And the voiceover also mentions the effects of pheromones on ant behavior, taking great pains to emphasize that the chemical signals laid down by the ants like have to be obeyed by the other ants. Like, in other words, they don't have a choice in how the chemicals make them act. Now, keep this little factoid in mind for later because it's going to pay off in an awesomely ludicrous way toward the end of the movie. So there's then a scene where dudes in like red hazmat suits are just merrily dumping barrels of toxic waste right into the fucking ocean. It's nice though because the barrels have a very helpful suggestion, do not open, like printed very prominently across the top. All the safety measures you need, really. So predictably, one of these barrels like washes up on a beach like minutes later and starts to leak this weird silvery goo. So then we get into the main part of the story. So our slumming actor this time around is none other than Dame Joan Collins, here playing a very shifty land developer named Marilyn, who has some valuable beachfront property that she would very much like to sell you. So she's taking this gaggle of prospective suckers like out to this island where her company is supposedly building this fancy new resort, though at the moment there's actually nothing there yet but some flags and like a bunch of signs saying things like future golf course and future beach club and all that kind of shit. So even though all of these people have ostensibly come on this free vacation, because it's kind of like a timeshare type situation, I guess, they've come here to look into a land investment, but the characters are mostly acting like they're on shore leave from the Love Boat. I mean, it's like, in the case of one dude named Larry, who's actually played by Robert Pine from Chips, I should probably call it the sexual assault boat because his character is literally introduced like forcibly groping another young woman on the tour. And you find out later that he has a wife named Christine, who's actually played by Jack Palance's daughter, Brooke. And his wife is like over, but with the others, like on the beach, like enjoying the subpar free booze, while her husband is over here, like, assaulting this woman. So once the assaulted young woman, whose name is Corrine, knees Jerry in the balls and escapes his, octopus-like tentacles, she immediately heads for the booze tent and starts laying the moves on this other dude who has this weird like black plastic hairstyle named Joe, and he actually initially resists her advances and kind of seems like a bit of a douche, which, it seems to be a running theme with all the dudes in this movie. Meanwhile, an older woman named Margaret is clearly trying to jump on the dinghy of the gruff boat captain, Dan, who's played by Robert Lansing, by the way, who I've seen in some other things. And basically how she's doing that is like essentially following him around and repeatedly asking him if he thinks she's making the right decision by investing in this beachfront property, even though he doesn't know her from Adam and strongly implies that he would like her to fuck off. Now, I will note that despite the seeming reluctance of these two dudes, like Joe and Dan, to become entangled with their respective female pursuers, both couples will be interacting as though they've been soulmates for decades by the time we're like 20 minutes into this movie. Like I said, like the Love Boat. So there are a couple more characters here and there. Like there's another guy named Charlie who I think works for the developer, and apparently he has a thing going with Marilyn because everyone has to partner off in this film, apparently. You have Groper Larry's aforementioned wife, Christine. And also there's an elderly couple named Harry and Velma. Oh, and there's also another couple who I think are named Thomas and Mary. They're the first ones taken out by the ants, so the only character development you get there is that Thomas wanders off from the group and finds out that a bunch of the water pipes coming out of the ground, like at some of the future build sites, aren't attached to anything, leading him to conclude that this whole beachfront property investment deal is a scam, which, duh. So all of the potential ant snacks, or people rather, get on board this little golf cart tram situation. And Charlie drives them around this supposed future resort while Marilyn is kind of, on the thing, giving them the hard sell. Now, not too long into the tour, they start hearing this weird, like, screamy, crickety kind of noise that, kind of freaks them out. And then all the guests are horrified at seeing the bare foot of, I guess, a corpse, like, sticking out of the trees. I don't think it's ever made clear, like, who the fuck this is. You know what I mean? It doesn't really matter, I guess. Now, shortly after this, they realize that Thomas and Mary aren't on the tram anymore. And spoiler alert, the audience already knows that they are already Aunt Chow because we saw the whole thing happen previously. And Joe and Corrine are the only two people with enough, balls to go and look for the wayward couple. Now, at one stage, the big ass ants crawl down the pier and onto Dan's boat, the one everyone got to the island on, by the way. And Dan and some other dude whose name I don't know, swim to the boat to try to save it, but the other dude gets killed, and then they end up exploding the shit out of the boat when it gets overrun with the big ass ants. So the people are apparently now trapped on the island with, I guess, no way off. But then one of the gang, Charlie or Marilyn, I think, remembers that there might be another small boat somewhere amidst the kind of swampy inland of this island. So they all set out to look for it. So for the next section of the movie, we basically follow sets of characters as they just tramp through the cloying Florida wilderness. This was shot in the Everglades, by the way. Either seeing the ants in a process shot and running away, or alternately getting mauled to death by gigantic ant puppets. Now, the remaining people eventually find the other boat. And then there's another endless fucking scene where they just row through the swamp, looking dirty and tired and talking about random bullshit that doesn't mean anything, seeing and hearing the ants every once in a while until they finally realize that the ants are actually herding them toward a specific destination. Now, this destination, it turns out, is an entire town that seemingly no one knew about beforehand, even though it's pretty decent sized and contains a massive sugar refinery. At which point you're like, uh-oh, you know who likes sugar, right? Me. I mean, no, ants do. That's what I mean. Now, this whole revelation of this town being here suddenly was really, really jarring to me because previous to finding the town, I thought it was implied that this island was empty except for this proposed resort. And the characters up until this point have certainly been acting as though they were stranded in the middle of the fucking Amazon rainforest and will perish within days, if they're not rescued. I mean, maybe somebody mentioned the existence of the town before they get to it, but if they did, I didn't catch it. Now, I will admit that I did doze off for a couple minutes here and there while I was watching it, so it's entirely possible that somebody said something about it and I was just sleeping during that time. So anyway, once they get to the town, the remaining survivor people, they check into this motel and get cleaned up and reoriented and blah, 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 and they're like, ooh, they're so relieved and everything. But everybody in town that they encounter is a little bit off. Not unfriendly necessarily, but they're just acting slightly weird. And the gang are also mindful of a warning they received earlier from this creepy older woman who lived with her husband in this shack on the outskirts of town. She told them, don't let anyone take you to the sugar refinery. But of course, that's exactly what ends up happening. The sheriff eventually strong arms most of the survivors into the factory, where it's revealed that, shocker, the queen ant of all the big ass ants resides in this sort of dual section phone booth type deal, inside the refinery, where the humans come in every so often and get sprayed with pheromones. Remember, I said that would come up again, that cause them to do the ants' bidding, which appears to mostly consist of just feeding them sugar and lots of it. So the residents of the town have got this whole organized system going on too. It's every week or so, I don't remember. They said how often it was, but I think it was every week or so. Everyone very obediently lines up single file outside the phone booth or the confessional or whatever it is. And then one by one they enter the thing and then they get hosed with the queen's mind control mist. It's very, very handy and all very organized. But Boat Captain Dan isn't having any of this commie ass hive mind horseshit though. And when he gets forced into the booth, he busts out a conveniently stowed flare from one of his trouser pockets. I don't remember when he put that in there. And sets the queen ant on fire. So the rest of the gang then kind of flee for their lives while the sugar refinery, burns to the ground, which presumably kills the rest of the ants as well. Now, as I mentioned, Empire of the Ants isn't quite as exquisitely terrible as Food of the Gods is. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's still bad, but it's not as ostentatious, I guess, as Food of the Gods, and is therefore considerably less fun. Now, the ant effects aren't great. Bert I. Gordon, he's utilizing the same techniques, which are like process shots for long distance and then puppets for close ups, that he used in his 50s era movies. I will note, too, that in one priceless sequence, in Empire of the Ants, the giant ants are very obviously crawling on a still photograph of the sugar refinery, and you can tell because a couple of them wander vertically onto the sky in the background. This particular sequence made me look fondly back on the crickets, which are kind of like clambering across a postcard of downtown Chicago in 1957's Beginning of the End. As kind of like rudimentary as the effects are, though, they're still much better than those half-assed brown smudges that passed for giant wasps in Food of the Gods. And Empire of the Ants at least has the benefit of presumably no animals other than maybe a couple of ants getting harmed in the making of it. So I could at least enjoy it with a clearer conscience. But Empire of the Ants is mostly just dull, though. I mean, the strange seediness of the random character Love Boat hookups at the beginning is funny, but it all just kind of goes on too long. And then once the ants start attacking, the whole movie starts to get like really, really repetitive. Like it doesn't get hilarious again until the very end, like with the whole Queen Ant in the phone booth setup, because I admit that I was really, really tickled thinking about Joan Collins being mind controlled by an enormous ant. So I feel like 70s eco horror is such a rich vein to mine. So I will probably like return to this subgenre with maybe another double feature sometime in the future. If you want to watch these two movies in particular, they're available for free on Plex if you have that. So, if you're into 70s eco horror, they're terrible, but they're fun terrible mostly. Food of the Gods more than Empire of the Ants. But hopefully you enjoyed this double feature in particular. And please remember to like and share this video if you enjoy the content, and also subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I'm really trying to build up this channel much bigger than it is currently. Also, please check out scaresalon.com, where I post like a lot more written content about horror stuff, books, movies, stuff like that. So yeah, that'll do it for this video, and I'll see you guys again on the next one. Bye.